Hi everyone. In this video I'm going to talk about the charts that you can see in my YouTube channel intro and how they make up a big portion of my approach to preflop study, which is unique from the way many other players study preflop. So I'm going to talk about it and why I've chosen to do things that way. First, why is preflop important in general? So obviously preflop decisions are the most frequent decisions that we come across in poker. Everything else builds on preflop, so knowing the ranges, knowing when they connect with different boards, what your bluffs are and so on, it's really important, and you can gain an edge by studying this harder, more ambitiously, and maybe also in a smarter way, and so that information sticks quickly and stuff. And exploitatively also, if you spend a lot of time studying preflop, you get a sense of what's hard for you to find, and your opponents are likely to miss this then, and you can think about how to exploit that if they're missing parts of what should be in the range in the solver. And then my approach to preflop studying is I made custom charts, self-made charts with colored pencil and grid paper. So it looks like this. You can order this online or find it maybe at a post office store. Some kind of grid paper that has enough space for enough grids, 13 by 13 for a poker hand matrix. Fill this in by hand, but only once, and then you can get it copied back and forth many times. So I made about 50 copies of this front page and back page, and then you have the hand matrix, and you can start coloring in the charts and customize them in the way that you would like to play or you would like to study. And this is one example of a big blind defend spot, and here it's 100 deep. So the benefits for me of doing things that way is, first off, even just producing the chart is not only a lot of fun, but it also adds to a lot of learning, because your brain memorizes things differently when you engage actively with the material, and when you think about why you want to do certain things in the hand, and also personalize the chart a bit. Don't just copy the solver frequencies, but think about how you want to play certain hands. This generates active learning, and maybe also this like visual pattern memorization when you simplify the patterns a bit, make them more memorizable. And I find it personally, I learn a lot faster, and the information sticks for longer when I do it this way. And then it's also nice to have the charts physically, so you can take them outside on walks or on cafes and so on. I would say, especially as for poker players, it's probably common that you are at risk of spending too much time in front of screens, and then it's nice to have, if you want to think about poker also outside the house, which maybe not everyone does, but then you have something to take there where it's not a screen and you can still do some poker learning. And then benefits in more direct poker terms are also that you can customize the charts. You can simplify them and only use 20%, 50%, and the 80% frequencies instead of the entire spectrum that the solver has, that is just confusing and intimidating. And you could definitely go even further and just simplify the pure frequencies and 50 mixes. That maybe I have too much of a detail orientation in that regard anyway. You can merge similar stack depths and produce charts that cover 25 big blinds and 30 big blinds in one, and make some trade-offs there, and then you have to learn fewer situations. You can personalize charts and amplify patterns so they become more memorizable, even if it creates slight deviations from the solver, because most things you do there don't really matter. And you can also leave out unintuitive solver plays that you think won't even work well against the populations of players that you're up against. And then you can simplify to using some of the same bluffing combos across similar spots. And you can add extra information in some charts, for instance, how to continue against 3-bets. So what you would 4-bet, what you would fold, what you would call. You can use different colors for this and have the information in one chart, so it's easier to learn when you look at that chart. And yeah, so that was basically my approach. I will give some more examples later. Before that, I just want to say that obviously there are other ways of studying preflop, and for many players, they do it differently, and the other ways are mostly about active studying from things like hand reviews or drills playing against the trainer. And both of those approaches also have their advantages. And the one thing I would not recommend is to just study solver charts as they are in the solver, because I think that my approach has clear advantages over this. But then if you have some form of active studying, that could be equally good or better for people with a learning style that is less about memorizing things directly and more about getting direct feedback when you review hands. So GTO Wizard, for instance, you can just upload them and it flags any sort of preflop inaccuracies, and you can just study the hands that you got wrong and then look at a solver sim in the context of the specific hand that you got wrong and memorize it that way, or just playing against the trainer. I would say it doesn't work that well in blind versus blind, because a lot of your plays are mixes, and you can play against the trainer and get blind versus blind right by mostly just checking everything that isn't a clear value play from the big blind, but you're still getting the shape of the strategy wrong because you don't bluff enough with trashy ISO raises. And so probably in blind versus blind, you don't just want to drill against the trainer, you want to actually look at charts. But other than that, yeah, the important thing is to have some kind of active studying routine, active in the sense that you're not just memorizing things, you're engaging with the content. But yeah, for me, the engaging with the content can also be just drawing my own charts and thinking about them. But I have done hand reviews a lot, and I've played against the trainer a lot, especially recently, and I recommend doing a bit of everything. And now I'll just give some examples of the specific things you get to do when you customize charts and how it improves learning. First, just with the frequency simplification. So that's an example of from GTO Wizard. Small blind plays against the button open. And when I look at this, I find it pretty intimidating. And I don't find myself motivated to really learn this in detail because it's just way too hard. And so for me, it's quite a relief to simplify it into something that looks more like this. So that's what I've done. That's my small blind versus button strategy at 100 deep that I try to implement. I don't even try to memorize those frequencies perfectly, especially because I know that in a sense they're simplifications, so it's even less important that I get them correctly than it would be if I was memorizing the solver strategy. But I do want to try to get the shape roughly correct here, and it's much nicer to look at this chart, and I find that the patterns stick more easily in my memory when I do it that way. And here they are side by side, so you can see. And I've chosen to not, I just took out those fringes of King 9, Jack 9, 10 9, because I find them unintuitive to play, and often in a tournament you will have a little bit of ICM pressure, and these calls are basically the first thing that comes out, and so I don't find it that important to learn those 0 EV calls. But if you have a personal style where you want to exploit players and play as many hands as possible, you can certainly leave them in, and that's kind of the point. You can add your own style to these preflop charts and personalize them. And here just one other example of a blind versus blind spot where you face an open at 100 deep. Obviously, a lot of players just play call everything, which is why I've maybe erred on the side of defending a little bit nittier. Like, I'm not defending Jack 7 offsuit. I'm not doing anything with Queen 5 offsuit. But still, I wanted to have a bit of an idea of the spot and simplify the frequencies. And so this is what I've done. Again, I'm not learning those frequencies either. I just want to have a sense of the rough shape of the spot. Then you can merge similar stack depths. So here's an example of big blind facing a limp at 20 blinds deep. And I've also looked at the 25 blinds deep spot, and I just added some notes on how to play it differently, but I mostly memorized the same chart for both situations. And then I have these notes that I'm taking out a few jams that are bluffs anyway. Although, to be honest, I probably would still shove the queen to offsuit because it just plays so well. And I don't think players trap enough, because your traps at 25 big blinds deep are mostly like, I think, ace 10 through ace king, and maybe some mixes of pocket pairs here. And most people just either shove them or start by raising the pocket pairs, and then your bluff shoves do really well in this spot. And then also, when you personalize charts, you can amplify patterns to make them more memorizable, and also decide which unintuitive plays to leave out. So here's an example of a pattern that I made a bit more distinct. This is small blind, blind versus blind, open at 50 blinds deep. It looks a bit like the 7x, the offsuited 7s here, open a bit more often than the hands right above. And so I made this pattern a bit more clear, not because it matters intrinsically that you open a lot of the 7, but I'm connecting it with a logic of what happens in the big blind response, and this makes it easier for me to also remember how to play the spot as the big blind, and creating these connections between the chart that you're looking at and the response by the other players is what helps me with learning these things and understanding the reason why a chart is the way it is. So if we go into the solve for this situation, when the small blind raises to 3.5 big blinds, the big blind also defends the 7x, but actually what I want to show is when the small blind calls instead of raises, and the big blind raises themselves, now the small blind has to fold these exact hands. So for me, it's quite intuitive that these hands like raising, because that way they get to see the flop more often, but they cannot raise every time because they're just among the weakest hands that you have, and if you raise them every time, your range gets too weak. But because these hands basically have to fold when you just call, and then the big blind will raise more than 40% of the time, they quite like raising even though they are among the weakest hand, and this way it becomes more memorizable. Now going back to a different example of simplification I made is this Queen 6 and Jack 6 offsuit at basically every stack depth from the big blind, blind versus blind. I've decided to make them pure checks. And in the solver, this isn't quite the case. They have, a small frequency of ISO raises, but it is one of the hand classes that checks the most often. And I guess I did a similar concept with the offsuited connected hands here, which, it which also shows that these are the hands that you don't want to get shoved on, and then you lose their equity and playability. But here with the queen six and the jack six, it's less about getting shoved on and more about what does your hand accomplish. And it accomplishes not much good, because if queen six or jack six raises from the big blind, the small blind just calls hands with better kickers and folds hands with worse kickers. And so in terms of clearance, jack six raises, gets jack five to fold, gets called by jack seven. That's just not an intuitive play. The solver anyway does these hands at the lowest frequency. So what I do is I check them pure, and this helps me memorize again the threshold of preflop calls that the other player will do against my raise. So I know now that they will call the 7x, because at 20 deep and 30 deep you raise to a slightly smaller size, and then the 7x will call, whereas at 50 deep it's more of the 8x that is the weakest offsuited defend. So yeah, these the point here is amplifying patterns in the chart and connect them to the response by the other players to create something that is memorizable for you and helps you understand how these charts are connected and the meaning behind them. And then also one thing I do is I use some of the same bluffing combos in similar spots where the solver uses slightly different bluffs, but I make it easier for me to memorize because the details don't really matter when you're bluffing. So one example here is this little region of suited king x and suited queen x bluffs. I made it the same also at 50 blinds deep and I believe 40 blinds or 30 blinds deep. I have it also roughly the same. And in the solver it looks slightly different, but I have found that the EVs are roughly the same for using these bluffs. And so, yeah, now I just memorize one type of bluff from the small blind. What I don't have the same is the bluffs in the suited ace regions, because I saw quite a meaningful difference where at 100 big blinds deep, we prioritize playability and strength because we don't really get shoved on very often. So ace 5 suited is obviously one of your best suited aces because it can make the straight, and ace 8 suited is pretty strong. So these raise pure at 100 blinds deep, but at 50 blinds deep it flips and you use the trashy ace 6 suited because sometimes you get shoved on, and the ace 5 suited mostly calls because it doesn't want to waste its playability and hand strength. So this flips, and that's also something I incorporated there. Or here I made this little like red color here for bluffs that I use at every stack depth. So ace 5 suited, ace 4 suited, king 7 suited, king 6 suited, and ace 5 offsuit a little bit is sort of my go-to bluff that I use at every stack depth in a big blind defense. Sorry, no, not at every stack depth. What I mean is against every position. 100 blinds deep against every position, I use these bluffs a bit. And then the blue ones are just versus cutoff and button. And this helps me have enough bluffs because I can memorize them more easily. And when you do this, you can always use the compare EV functionality in GTO Wizard to see how much sense a certain simplification makes. So for instance here, big blind defense, 100 deep, button raises, we're in the big blind. We see here, for instance, that queen 6 suited and jack 7 suited raise against the button open. They also raise against the hijack open, against the cutoff open. But when we go to a hijack open, the jack 7 suited no longer raises. But what if someone wanted to just use this one as a bluff? You can see how much of a difference it makes, and you can go compare EV, compare the raise to call, you see that it's only one apart. So if you just for some reason felt like it simplifies your play to use this combo also against the hijack, I would say this is totally fine and you can go for it. And so you can use the compare EV functionality to do that. But my personal bluff selection is a bit different, and against the hijack I also use this king 6 suited, king 7 suited, ace 5 suited, ace 4 suited. And then last, you can sometimes add extra information to a chart. So probably most people watching this video are quite well versed in just opening charts, especially at 100 big blinds deep. But to make the chart more interesting, you can add the information about how to react to a 3-bet. And I did two versions of the chart. So you can compare how to play against a button 3-bet and a small blind 3-bet. And the big difference is that versus the button, your 4-bets for value are all mandatory, especially the ones that the really strong hands. Queens plus are mandatory 4-bets, whereas against the small blind 3-bet, you have the option to slow play, and even kings in the solver slow plays. At the time when I made this chart, I felt like that was quite unintuitive. I have since changed my mind about this after experimenting with these slow plays, and today I would slow play kings 2 sometimes. So if I were to make a new version of this chart, against aggressive opponents it can go quite well. Against needy opponents who only 3-bet with value, I would always fast play kings and hope that they will jam. But yeah, this is why you think about how your opponent plays. You don't just follow solver strategies, but it's good to know what options are open to you, and it's good to know that these slow plays are an option that is very much open to you to use against opponents who are aggressive enough or too aggressive. And then what about ICM studying? So far I've only showed chipEV charts. Obviously getting really good at chipEV play helps with ICM, but I would say that separate ICM studying, well, obviously it's separate ICM studying is still mandatory because the differences are quite big. But then I would say hand reviews and drills are probably better than charts for ICM studying, because ICM spots just have too many variables and it would be really hard to isolate the most important things into charts because there are just too many situations. And sure, you could have some anchor charts that you memorize, and then any real life ICM spot that you find, you try to remember which anchor chart is sort of the closest to it and get inspiration from that. But then you have to be very careful not to misapply concepts, because if the average stack depth is a bit bigger than in your example chart, or there is no short stack in the situation, or the shortest stacks are even shorter or deeper, then the differences might be so big that you make a big mistake when you anchor too much on your chart that you memorized, and you should instead just be thinking about the situation using fresh intuition and sort of reasoning on the go when you see an ICM situation. So I have made some ICM charts too. For instance, there's this common pattern when you're a chip leader, you have a dominating lead, you can bully blind versus blind the big blind from the small blind. And then the range looks like this with a lot of shoving, a lot of really trashy raise folds, hands value range that you raise and call off, and then also some hands that you raise fold, but they do well against the calling range. They're hands that only calls like this area. But even just like this chart, I don't really memorize it. I just want to be familiar with this type of shape, because where exactly the inducing threshold is, where you call off their all-in, really differs from spot to spot. And here it's ace 10 offsuit, but it can be sometimes only ace queen offsuit, or I don't know, ace 9 offsuit. And yeah, the whole chart just looks different depending on the distribution at the table. Here it's 40 20 20 20 with the stack setup. And yeah, my point is just with ICM, the main thing you probably want to do is hand reviews and ICM drills with the trainer to get good ICM intuition. And maybe a little bit of anchored charts like this, but be quite careful about misapplying concepts because the thresholds will change in quite extreme ways. And then which charts should you prioritize, should you start with? I think it's probably more important to get decent everywhere first before you become an expert and spend too much time in just specializing in one area. And also you want to start with situations that come up a lot, obviously, that you don't yet know how to play. And so especially shallow stacked situations come up a lot in tournament, also after late registration has passed, if you're often late registering tournaments. And then also big blind's defense come up a lot because the big blind is the position that plays the defense the most hands, that VPIPs the most, basically. So probably start with big blind defense at various stack depths and short stacked opening charts like 15 deep, 20 deep, reshoves maybe 20 deep or 30 deep from the small blind. Button versus cutoff is a spot that comes up a lot, and it can be kind of tricky to play. And then also blind versus blind, I would say it's a bit harder to study because things change so much based on different stack depths. And so maybe there's a lower benefit to effort ratio, which means don't necessarily make this your first study. But at the same time, I think a lot of players are too intimidated by it and then they're bad at it. And so once you do put in the effort, it can generate quite a confidence boost and probably also adds EV to your play. So at some point, somewhat soon, you should also get into blind versus blind and just go step by step. So here are just some examples of charts that I talked about that I find maybe particularly important to study. So this is 15 deep opens and open shoves. Low check, I would mention, is the earliest position where I play open shoves. I think they're less important and they don't really get played from early position except for maybe fringes. So, and then in ICM they come out completely. So I just memorize some open shoves from the low check and none from early positions. And high check you see here, cutoff, button plays limps. I recently learned that when you play in unequal stacked situations and you're the shortest stack from the button, but small blind and big blind are deeper with each other, many of the limps here actually become open raises because you kind of handcuff the small blind against the big blind. The small blind cannot reshove against you when they're 40 deep with the big blind. So they can only play like a heavy, small 3-bet range, against which many of these hands here can actually just call. And so you don't need to limp so much anymore. And if you want to be really detailed, you can do two charts. The one is where small blind and big blind are also short, and one is where it's unequal chipEV. And then also once ICM pressure comes in, the limps come out, more of these hands just turn into folds with ICM. And then often you want to have something to look at that is small blind reshoves. They're actually quite easy to learn. Not a lot of complexity to these strategies. What I often do is I note down the worst offsuited hand that the other position calls against my all-in. And that makes me understand the strategy here. For instance, small blind versus cutoff. I wrote here that the cutoff starts calling ace-9 offsuit, and that's why ace-8 offsuit is not a pure shove. It's not super excited about shoving, but it can do it. And then ace-10 offsuit is a pure shove because it gets called by worse. And that way I remember things. And here is what I talked about, how button versus cutoff. It's quite interesting how the offsuited aces change what they do. So at 100 deep, ace queen offsuit 3-bets a lot. At 50 deep, it basically stops 3-betting because it doesn't love getting shoved on. It's good to have protection against the big blind squeeze, because I think we would call against the big blind squeeze. And then 40 deep, it can do a bit of everything, but the strategy is mostly calling. And then 30 deep, it becomes an all-in. And 20 deep, I don't have here, but 20 deep, you do really a lot of shoving with most of your pocket pairs and ace-jack and even some ace-10. Squeeze charts, I didn't mention this in the earlier slide, but squeeze charts are also quite valuable because many players miss these. And finding squeezes, it's just so often that you get fold, and these hands really print money as squeezes, both the bluffs and the value hands. And so obviously there are so many squeeze situations so that it makes sense just to have some reference point. And the big one is obviously button and small blind in the pot and you're in the big blind, because that's where your ranges are the loosest and also where the situation happens the most often, because you're up against the widest ranges. But then maybe you can also have like another reference spot that is more in the middle, something like hijack opens, button calls, and squeeze from the big blind. So yeah, I think we're at the end of the presentation. I just want to again mention the other ways of preflop studying, hand reviews, and playing versus the trainer that I also very much recommend. And persistence wins over speed. So if you just stick to the practice and you do maybe 1 page of charts every 2 weeks, in a year that's 25 pages of charts, which gets you really, really far, especially if you prioritize the areas that you think are most valuable to study and where you're currently not good at, and that will generate into a lot of progress. So yeah, persistence over speed is really key, and good luck studying preflop no matter which approach you end up choosing.